It took her a long time to come on,
Thank
didn't
you.
it?
Okay, so we are going to be looking at Ruth chapter 2, the second half of this, beginning in verse 14 through the end of the chapter. But more than anything else today, we're going to be looking at the issue of grace. Now, we all know, or if we don't know, there's somewhat of an antiseptic definition of grace, unmerited favor. Well, we have a wonderful saying here at Grace School of Theology that the love of God is a love that cannot be earned and cannot be lost. Well, that cannot be earned and cannot be lost. That's grace. And so this kind of antiseptic statement about grace, unmerited favor, something that is a gift given to us that we don't earn, is going to come into full bloom here in the second half of chapter 2. We're going to look very specifically at the goal of grace. And it may surprise you to understand what the goal of grace is. We're going to also look at the goodness of grace, the abundance of grace. And then finally, we're going to look at a little play on words here. We're going to look at the Goel of grace. It's a Hebrew word. It's another Hebrew word we're going to use today and learn today. But we're going to look at the Goel of grace. So we're in chapter 2. What we have just found out is that Ruth has gone in. They've returned. Ruth and Naomi have returned to Bethlehem. Ruth has gone in based on the covenant promise. She's gone in to glean. She has gleaned in the fields of Boaz, who we've learned on the backside is a relative of Naomi, a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's husband. And we conclude the section that we looked at last week with verse 13, where Ruth says to Boaz, the owner of the field, "Let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." So we get this wonderful look at Ruth, who, walking in humility, walking in the absolute promises of the covenant from God, recognizing that covenant and seeing that poured out on her through Boaz, we get this wonderful statement of her asking if he would shower his grace upon her. Let me find favor. Let me find grace, chen, in your sight, my Lord. And he has, we know, he has called her daughter. He has elevated her. He has raised her up, though she is a poor widow working in the fields. He has elevated her. So we start in verse 14, which is the continuation of this story. Now remember, they've returned. This is the next day. She's gone out into the fields. So Ruth has immediately begun to apply the covenant promise of God. Starting in verse 14, let's look at 14 through 16. This is going to be the goal of grace and a true understanding of what the goal of grace is. Now Boaz, after she makes this statement, "I'm your maidservant, let me find grace in your sight," Boaz said to her at mealtime, "Come here, eat of the bread, dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers. He passed parched grain to her. She ate and was satisfied and kept some back. Now, let's stop right there, because there's a whole lot happening in this little, seemingly insignificant little verse. So Boaz says to Ruth at mealtime, "Come here, eat of the bread, dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So he makes an invitation to Ruth to come join them at mealtime. So what has he just done with Ruth?
Included her.
He's included her. Now remember, in the hierarchy where she is, you get Boaz, you get the servants, you get the male reapers, you get the female reapers, and then you get the lowliest of the low, you get the poor and the widows. So she's at the bottom of the food chain, but he has now included her into the mealtime. He says to her, "Come in, eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." There's these verbs that are used of him. These are action verbs that he is actually including her, bringing her into this family, into the family of workers here. So come here, eat of the bread, dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. He is extending this grace to her. Now remember, she has just said, let me find favor. Is he now extending that grace to her?
Yes.
Is he now extending that favor to her? Because
Yes.
in the hierarchy that was here, here's Boaz up here, here's Ruth down here, that they shouldn't even be talking to each other according to the custom of the day. She should not have any dealings with him at all. And yet now, not only has he recognized her and noticed her, he's brought her into the meal and now actually offered to serve her the meal. This is, first of all, it shows the character of Boaz. But second, it shows how Boaz has regarded her as literally my daughter. So come here, dip your piece of bread in the vinegar, eat of the bread, come and be part of this. So she sat beside, where did she sit? Who's she sitting beside? The workers. So is she now at the bottom of the food chain, or has she moved up?
She moved upward.
She's sitting with the workers. She's now considered in that part. She's been included in with one of the workers. And now he serves her. He passes parched grain to her. Notice what she does. She eats. And by the way, she eats enough to be full. She eats and is satisfied. But then look at what the text says she does. What does she do?
Some bags.
Holds some back. Who's she holding it back for?
Naomi.
Do we begin to see the grace coming from God to Boaz, the grace coming from Boaz to Ruth, and now the grace coming from Ruth to Naomi? This is Naomi holding true to her covenant promise to Naomi that I will care for you. So even this little meal, she gets a doggy bag. She puts a doggy bag aside. So, and I just want you to see what's happening here, because what happens is Boaz meets her immediate need. This is what grace does first. It meets the immediate need. And remember, she's come back from Bethlehem. She's come back from Moab. They've had a long travel. They came in. The next day she goes out to glean. We don't see anywhere in the text that she's actually eaten. So the immediate need of Ruth gets met right here. She's worked all morning. She's come to the mealtime in the afternoon. And the first thing that Boaz does is he graciously serves her lunch to feed her. What she does is she eats, and now she thinks about Naomi. How does the grace that has flowed to me now begin to flow out to somebody else? The beautiful nature of this. Now, let's just think for a moment. Who's watching? Who's peering into this interchange?
The workers.
The workers. The world is seeing this exchange of grace. They are seeing how Boaz has treated this outcast. They are seeing the humility of this outcast and her keeping some back. There is this view into this blessing of grace that I guarantee to you, friends, the world watches us to see how we treat one another. Are we extending the grace that we know from God? Are we extending that grace to one another? Because the world's watching to see how we do this. So we get this beautiful picture of this extension of grace. Now, how do you think Ruth feels right now about Boaz? Okay, here's what I heard. So
Very grateful. Grateful.
Somebody say
Thankful,
something.
blessed.
Grateful, yes. And do you think there's a little bit of a closer connection between Ruth and Boaz?
Probably, yeah.
Probably so. He probably feels a little bit more connected to her. She probably feels much more connected to him just by the simple sharing of this meal, this outpouring of grace. Verse 15, she rose up to glean. Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves. Do not reproach her. Also let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it, that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. Now, a number of things are happening right here. First of all, let's take a view that she doesn't sit back after a nice meal and go, I think I'm going to go take a nap. She gets up, and starts to glean again. She goes back to work. So when she rises up to glean, and here's what Boaz says. He says to his young men, let her glean even among the sheaves and do not reproach her. Now, there's two things happening here. She's had her immediate need met. So that immediate need, she's got food, she gets up, she begins to glean again, so she's got purpose. But then Boaz says to the young men, let her glean among the sheaves. Now, gleaning used to happen around the edges of the fields. And that's where everything that had been dropped or been trampled upon, this was the leftovers. But what he is now commanding his young men to do, and that is to allow her to follow them down the rows, and the good grain that has fallen and been left behind, she has access to that. She's not around the outside edges anymore. She has access to the grain right in the middle. And then he says, don't reproach her. This is a wonderful statement he makes to her that says, don't make her feel like she's one of the lowly. I don't want you to reproach her. I want you to make her feel like she's a part of the group. She is a part of the workforce. She is actually here. She's not the lowliest of the low anymore. I want you to make her feel like, and allow her to glean where I'm telling you to glean. And then he says in verse 16, also let grain bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it that she may glean and do not rebuke her. In other words, as the cart's going down the rows, kick a little of the extra off the cart. Let the good stuff fall to her. But I don't want you to don't make her feel like you're doing this out of pity. I want you to do this for her so that she has that sense, that understanding that she's actually done the gleaning, she's done the good work, and this is the reward for the good work. So when we look at this, immediately what has happened is 4 things have been satisfied now for Ruth. And I want you to just hear it again, because this is what grace does. The first thing is her immediate need is taken care of. Grace sees a need and helps to fill it. Second, her physical need is taken care of. And sometimes grace absolutely helps to fulfill a physical need. So now she has food. She's actually doing the work to have food. Third, there has been an emotional need that has been met. She's not made to feel lowly. She's not made to feel beneath anyone. She has been raised, so emotionally she feels like she's on a par with these workers. And finally, there is a spiritual need that has been filled here, because he has abundantly blessed her. She gets a chance to see the abundant blessing that is coming out of the covenant promise. And yes, Boaz is going above and beyond, but isn't that what grace does? Doesn't grace go above and beyond? So we get this beautiful picture of what grace does, the goal of grace. And now that this is happening, we get a beautiful picture of what's happening to Ruth. She's been elevated. Her needs have been met. She's feeling good about herself. She's connected more deeply to the workers. She's connected more deeply to Boaz, and Boaz down to them. If you had done this, how would you feel if you were Boaz right now? Would you feel good?
Sure.
Would you feel put out? Yeah. What does grace do? Grace not only is a benefit to those that we extend grace to, but we get the blessing of having graced others. This is what grace does. And so what we see in this opening section is that the goal of grace, and I want you to hear this really carefully, the goal of grace is intimacy. The goal of grace is intimacy, because what grace does, especially when it's intimacy with Jesus Christ, it is that once we begin to understand and see how we have been blessed, how we have been graced, it can do nothing more than draw us closer to the one who has graced us. So the goal of grace, and if you look at this, why did Christ go to the cross in the first place? What was his purpose? To create a way for us to have a relationship with him, to bring us right to the throne room of God, to develop that intimate relationship that could not have been made possible unless he had gone to the cross, unless he had extended that grace abundant to us. So when you think about it, we get this wonderful picture of grace, this beautiful showing of grace, where Boaz knows how he's been blessed. He blesses Ruth. and blesses her abundantly to meet every one of her needs. And now she is beginning to take that grace, and we're going to see in a moment how she extends that grace to Naomi. This is what grace does. And in this, I can guarantee to you, Ruth will feel closer to Naomi, Naomi to Ruth, Ruth feels closer to Boaz, Boaz closer to Ruth. And there's going to be a pretty big picture opening here when we get into the last part of these verses. But what I'm going to tell you again is that the goal of grace is intimacy, and in specific, intimacy in a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's the goal of grace. What grace does when we understand and recognize the grace of God, what does it do for us with God? How do we feel toward him? Yeah. And when that flows from us to others, what happens in those relationships when grace flows from us to others? We feel closer?
Yes.
The bond more deep? Yes. So the goal of grace is intimacy, especially in our relationship with Jesus Christ. And so I ask the question here, do I recognize the abundant grace around me? And if I do I see it drawing me into a closer relationship with Christ? If that's the purpose of grace, do I recognize how graced I am? And do I see that? And as I recognize grace, does it draw me into a closer relationship with Christ? There's your purpose. Verses 14, 15, 16, this beautiful unfolding of grace. We look at verse 17. So, because all of this happened, because there was all this stuff that was being done for her, sheaves of grain shoved off the edge of the cart, going down the actual rows, gleaning among the sheaves. She gleaned in the field until the evening. Now, how long did she work?
All day.
All day. She worked all day. And then she beat out what she had gleaned. And it was about an ephah of barley. Now, I just got to take you back for just a minute. Where is she? She's in the field of Boaz. Where is Naomi?
Home.
Sulking.
Who's doing the work? Yeah, nursing the grudge. Who's doing the work? Who's doing the work?
Ruth.
Who's not doing the work?
Naomi.
Who's receiving the blessing of the grace?
Both of them.
Who's not receiving the blessing of the grace? I want you to think about this. Think about this for a minute. Think about Ephesians 2:10. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for what?
Good works.
Which he has prepared beforehand. Let me just ask you, are we walking in an Ephesians 2:10 moment right here? What was provided for by the covenant promise for someone like Ruth, an outcast, a widow, a poor? What was provided was gleanings. But gleanings don't get into the basket by themselves. Somebody has to go out and gather the gleanings and put them into the basket. Somebody has to go out and beat the heads of grain to get the kernels out. This is grace extended, but somebody has to walk in that grace. Somebody has to recognize the grace and walk in the grace. So what we get is this beautiful statement that Ruth, she's walking in the covenant promise. She's walking in the promise of grace, and she is blessed abundantly. Now, she's going to bless Naomi, but and we're going to get to Naomi in a minute, but she takes this grain, she pounds it out, she beats it out, and she gets an ephah of barley. Now, raise your hand if you know how much an ephah of barley is.
I don't know. Is it a bushel?
Ooh, good. And if you haven't looked at the notes,
Is it a bushel?
here's what we know. An ephah of barley is about 2/3 of a bushel.
Oh,
I know that helped you a tremendous amount because everybody knows what a bushel is.
How much a bushel?
yeah, bushel and a peck.
Yeah, there you go. It totals about 30 pounds of grain. 30
That's a lot.
pounds
Yeah.
of grain. So when she
Carry
worked,
home.
Yeah, exactly.
we're going to get to that. It's a good question. She beats the heads of the grain. The kernels come out. She threshes and gets 30 pounds of barley. This is all of a sudden. Remember what we said? What's the necessity for survival? You have to have children and you have to have
Food.
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 This is at minimum a week's worth of food. This is more food than they've seen in a while. And so she has pounded out, done this actual work. She's walked in that work. She's walked in that grace, and she's actually done the work and pounded out 30 pounds of barley. This would have lasted them for a number of days. This is, like I said, it's an Ephesians 2:10 moment. So she takes it, this wonderful piece of barley, this wonderful ephah of barley. She took it up and went into the city. Now, just think about this for a moment. Somebody said it. She's got 30 pounds of grain. You know how they carried the grain?
On their heads.
So if
That's
you've ever
easier,
picked
Ed.
up 30 pounds, think about 30 pounds walking from the fields into the city. Might have been a mile, might have been 2 miles, might have been 3 miles. But she did it on top of her head. Put 30 pounds on your head and try walking a couple of miles. You may have seen pictures in the past of Ruth as this tall, slender reed of a woman. I'm sorry, but there was some stoutness to Ruth. She's just worked in the field. She was a woman. She's worked in the field all day. She put 30 pounds of grain on her head, and she's walking from the field back into town. There's some stoutness to this woman. She takes it and she goes into the city, and now it says in verse 18, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So she comes to the front door of the house.
Mhm.
Her mother-in-law, interesting, the storyteller says that, her mother-in-law, this is who she is, who Ruth is working for, who she is promised to, saw what she has gleaned, so she brought out and gave to her what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. Now, what's the storyteller telling us here? Ruth comes home. She puts 30 pounds of grain down in front of Naomi, and then what does she do?
She gets out the good stuff.
Takes
The
out
good
the
stuff.
leftovers.
From lunch.
She
The
gets the
doggy.
leftovers from lunch. She takes
Yeah,
out the doggy
yeah.
bag, and she meets the immediate need of Naomi. Just as her immediate need was met at lunch, she now meets the immediate need of Naomi. Do you see what grace does? Grace just flows. It just flows out of us. So she brings this grain. She lays it down. She's got it in front of her. She puts down these 30 pounds. She then takes out the little doggy bag and she feeds her and takes care of her immediate need. This is Ruth holding true to the covenant promise that she would care for the widow Naomi. So we get this beautiful thing, and let's ask the question, do we see anything here where Ruth held anything back? No. She gives abundantly out of what she has been graced with. She pours that grace forward. I will tell you a story. It's a fun story. A family friend of ours, we were in a small group with them for probably 15 years. They had 4 boys. And they decided one Christmas that they wanted to start a tradition in their family. The tradition in their family was that they were going to pray about a family that they could bless out of the abundance of what God had blessed them with. So they would, as a family, they would pray specifically for God to raise up a family that they could go bless. And then they would go out for a month and they would select very specific gifts, 12 of them, right before Christmas. And 12 days before Christmas, including Christmas Day, they would sneak up and put one new present on their front porch every single day for 12 days anonymously. Well, as their boys got a little bit older and could begin to drive, the boys started having a competition about could they actually do this. And they would drive up in the middle of the night. They would drive up at 2 and 3 in the morning. They'd try to put the packages up there. Nobody could see them. But every family that they would bless with a specific gift 12 days in a row, right up to Christmas. We asked them as a small group why they did this. Their answer was what you would have expected, because we have been graced. We want to grace others. And we said, but you've made it anonymous. And they said, well, yeah, it's a whole lot more fun to hear the families talk about how they've been blessed and never know where it came from than it would be to step in and say, oh, yes, we did that for you. And so we got the benefit of hearing these wonderful stories of families that were blessed for 12 straight days right before Christmas. And most often they were families that were in a hard way. It was a tough time. The fathers had been out of work, or there was something happening in the family, and they figured out these were ways we could bless them. And what they said was, as we have been graced, so we want to grace others. We want to pour it out on others. And again, as a small group, we were the wonderful recipients of story after story after story of the families that they had blessed. That's what grace does. Grace pours itself out. And as we recognize grace around us, we see the goal of that grace being to be blessed by the one who has blessed us, Jesus Christ, and to be in that intimate relationship with him. Wonderful statement about what was going on. So let's look at verse 19. This is the goodness of grace unfolded. She brings this food back, verse 19, and her mother-in-law said to her, where have you gleaned today? In other words, where did you get so much good grain? Where have you gleaned today? And where did you work? And then she says this, blessed be the one who took notice of you. So Ruth tells her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Now, if you're a Jewish audience and you've been waiting for this moment, because you've heard, as the recipient of the story, you've heard behind the scenes that there is this relationship between Naomi and Boaz. And you've probably wondered to yourself, why didn't Naomi, when she came back, go find Boaz? Because he's a relative. Why didn't that ever happen? Well, we don't get anything from the text other than she stayed in the house. She didn't go out in the fields. She didn't go glean. She didn't go do anything that was according to the covenant promise. And yet, what does God do? He directs these efforts. And now we get the mother-in-law, we get Naomi saying, where have you gleaned today? Well, actually, if Naomi had gone out with her, she would have known where she gleaned today. And actually, if Naomi had really thought about it, she probably could have said, let's go glean in Boaz's fields. He's a relative. Where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you. Now, I just want to tell you, we're starting to get just a hint that maybe Naomi is returning a little bit to pleasant, because she's now said, whoever has blessed us with this, whoever has graced us with this, blessed be he who took notice of you. I just think about this for a moment. What did Ruth say to Boaz? Let me find favor in your sight. Now Naomi says, blessed be the one who found favor in your sight. Blessed be the one who took notice of you. So she told her mother-in-law, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Now look at that statement real quick. This does not say the man's name who I worked for was Boaz. How does Ruth describe the relationship?
With him.
With him.
Equal, really.
I worked
Equal.
with him. I
With him.
worked alongside him.
Yeah.
Now, think about this for a moment. Christ calls us into a relationship with him. And he says there are good works. He also calls us into a partnership to work with him. What has he just done to us? What's he done to our status? He's elevated us. Absolutely. This is exactly what Boaz has done with Ruth. Remember, she just a few verses earlier said, I'm your servant. Now she is saying, I worked alongside of him. Well, this says a whole lot about Boaz because he's actually working in the fields with them. But now we get Ruth who says, I worked with him. Would we ever dream of saying, I'm going to put this in a tough way. Would we ever dream of saying that we could work alongside the God of the universe? And yet the God of the universe says, I've prepared works already for you. Just walk in them and walk with me. We're called into a partnership. Does God have to work with us? Did God need, or did Boaz need Ruth to work in the field?
No.
Does God need us? No. But he desires us to work with him, to work alongside him, to work in partnership with him. I love the way Paul puts this all throughout the book of Philippians, that we are partners together in the gospel. We are partners together in this grace. It's just a beautiful illustration. So we get this. This is what's happening. The man's name is Boaz. This is who it is that's coming. This is who it is that you've been blessed with. And I want to show you one other really interesting key here, and maybe a key for the really difficult E word, evangelism. Hang on. This is evangelism. Just watch what's happened here. Ruth comes home, and she has had an experience of grace. And the evidence of that grace is all around her. She brings back and shares with her, here's what's happened. I went and worked in the fields today. Look at what I brought home. That immediately moves Naomi to ask questions. When Naomi asks questions, what does Ruth get the chance to do? In other words, who's blessed you? Who's graced you? Who's done this for you? What does Ruth get a chance to do?
Tell us who it is.
Tell the truth.
Tell who it is.
Yeah.
Does that say anything to us as we have been graced? If how we have been graced begins to be evident in our lives, if we actually can reflect the grace that Christ has abundantly blessed us with, would it not cause people to stop and say, who's done this to you? How has this happened for you? The minute that happens, we get the chance. We don't have to dream up. We don't have to facilitate some kind of spiritual discussion that can be uncomfortable at times. The natural occurrence is, as we live in the grace that we've been blessed with, people are going to wonder what's going on. It's going to raise questions. As it raises questions, it gives us the chance to tell them about the one who has graced us, the one who has blessed us. Friends, that's the best evangelism there ever is. Because it is simply a byproduct of, look what good has happened to me. And by the way, when something good has happened to you, don't you want to share it with your friends?
Mm-hmm.
So when you're beaming because you've been graced, your friends are going to say, what's happened to you? Well, let me just tell you how I've been graced by Jesus Christ. Let me just tell you who did this for me. Let me just tell you how I've been blessed. So we get this beautiful, beautiful statement about how we can actually have conversation about who Jesus Christ is simply by reflecting how we have been graced and how we have been blessed. Naomi's blessed, and she's actually blessed by Boaz, and she never even knows it. Actually, this is a little bit of Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. She has been graced. And what do you think is going to begin to happen to Naomi's faith now?
Gonna grow.
Yeah. Stronger.
Because she's returned, and now there is food. There is absolutely the evidence of food is now sitting in front of her, at least for a week. This food is there. This is a beautiful statement about just the goodness of grace, because the goodness of grace, where the goal of grace is this intimacy, the goodness of grace is infectious. And it is infectious because we reflect the person of Jesus Christ. We're not only in a deeper relationship with him, but as we are graced and that grace flows from us, we actually reflect him to the point that other people want to know what's going on with us. Chuck Swindoll used to put it this way, that there is no greater need among Christians than the need for outrageous joy. Outrageous joy from a band of people that understand how incredibly graced they have been and continue to be. That outrageous joy through nothing else is going to reflect Jesus Christ to the world, and a world that, by the way, desperately needs to know him. So let me share another story with you. There was a little girl who was on her way home from church in the car with her mom, and she looked at her mom and she said, "Mom, the preacher said something that confused me." Probably not the first time or the last time she'd be confused by something a preacher said, but she was confused by something the preacher said. The mother said, "Well, tell me what confused you." She said, "Well, the preacher said that God is bigger than we are. Is that right?" And she said, "Well, yes, that's right." And then she said, "The preacher said that God lives inside of us. Is that right?" She said, "That's right." She said, "Well, what confuses me is if God is bigger than us and he lives inside of us, then why doesn't he shine out of us?"
Oh. Good one.
This, friends, is what grace does. Grace shines out of us. And we see a beautiful example of that in Ruth. And you have to ask yourself the question, does grace shine out of me? Do other people see the reflection of the grace of Christ in me? Well, now I want to turn you to these last three verses, 20 through 23, and it really gets fun here. Verse 20, so the man's name is Boaz. That's the one whom I worked with. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, and notice how she has shifted here. She says, "Blessed be he of the Lord." Now, hang on just a minute. Blessed be he. Who's the he she's talking about here? She's talking about Boaz. Blessed be Boaz, a man of the Lord. Well, wait a minute. If I go back just one chapter and I see when she returns, "Don't call me pleasant, call me Mara, because the Lord has dealt bitterly with me." Now all of a sudden she's, "Blessed be he of the Lord who has not forsaken his kindness." Whose kindness are we talking about here? His kindness?
God's kindness.
This is God's kindness, and that kindness is that word chesed. So, blessed be he of the Lord who has not forsaken God's kindness to the living, Ruth and Naomi, and the dead, Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion. What has she just done? Who has she just attributed grace to?
God.
God. Where was she a day ago? Friends, if I could tell you this, what does grace do to us? Transforms us. She's returned to the land physically. God begins to bless, and begins to bless to the point that she now begins to recognize, and actually, if you're the Jewish audience, you're going, maybe she's coming back to the Naomi that we really want her to be, not the Naomi that she's been. Blessed be he of the Lord who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and to the dead. Blessed be this man of the Lord. Just this beautiful statement she makes, and it's the beautiful statement that she makes about the loyal love of God for her. So this is the one who is being blessed. Naomi said to her, "This man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives." Now, I want to give you this Hebrew word here, because what she says is, this man is one of our relatives. In fact, he is a close relative. That word is the Hebrew word Goel, G-O-E-L. Goel literally translates to kinsman-redeemer. Kinsman-redeemer. Boaz is a kinsman-redeemer. Now, there's a couple things you need to really pay attention to here. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he of the Lord who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead." Naomi said to her, "This man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives. That's the kinsman side. He is our relative. The redeemer side has to do with what was called a levirate marriage. A kinsman-redeemer, a Goel, could step in and he could redeem property, family, heritage, lineage, and the name. So what a levirate marriage did, and we talked about this in chapter 1, what a levirate marriage was that if your husband died, if there was a relative in the family, the relative could marry the widow, have children, keep the land intact, keep the family intact, produce a new heir, new inheritance, and keep the legacy of the family going. This comes out of actually Leviticus 25, and this allowed God to be able to keep the promised land and the promised seed of the family intact. So notice what Naomi's doing now. Naomi sees the possibility of what now might happen. Food is now a part of the equation, but now there is the potential of family and children as a part of the equation, because she's the one that says this is a close relative, this is a Goel, this is a kinsman-redeemer. He is one of us, and he is the Redeemer. And I want to just take you to John chapter 1 for a moment. John chapter 1, verse 14. And Christ took on flesh, and actually, Eugene Peterson says it this way, and moved into our neighborhood. He became one of us. Does this sound a little bit like a kinsman redeemer? Our Redeemer moved in, became one of us, took on flesh, and actually, as Peterson says, he moved into our neighborhood, and our neighborhood was not the best neighborhood on the earth. It was a bad neighborhood. This is what Christ did voluntarily. This is what grace does. This is what the Goel does. He is the kinsman, relative, redeemer, the one who buys it all back. And that's actually what redeemer means, to be bought back. To redeem is to buy back. I don't know if you know the story about the little boy in his sailboat. Have you ever heard this story? Little boy in his sailboat, he has spent time and effort and energy building this little tiny sailboat. He crafts it. He makes the sails out of fabric his mother has given him. It's a little balsa wood sailboat. He paints it. He makes it perfect. He takes it out on this little lake one day. It's attached to a string, and the wind begins to blow. And all of a sudden, the string snaps, and the sailboat takes off down the lake, and it's lost. Well, this little boy just is heartbroken, and he searches all down the streams. He goes week after week trying to find this little boat, and one day he wanders into the next neighborhood, and he finds a little boy who is playing with a sailboat, and it's his sailboat. And he looks at the little boy, and he says, "That's my sailboat." And the little boy says, "Finders keepers, losers weepers." He says, "Well, what would it take for me to get my sailboat back?" The other boy says, "What do you have?" He reaches into his pocket and he says, "I have 25 cents. I have my favorite marbles, and I have this little pocket knife." The other boy says, "I've always wanted a pocket knife. Here, take your boat back. I'll take your marbles. I'll take your most treasured possessions in your pocket. I'll take them." And as the little boy walks away with his sailboat, he says, "You are twice mine. I made you, and I have bought you back." What Christ says to us is, you are twice mine. I made you, and by my death on the cross, I have redeemed you. I have bought you back by grace. That's how much I love you. The beautiful picture we get of the Goel, and what Naomi is now thinking is, I have one who could potentially buy back my name, buy back my heritage, buy back my land, buy back my family, and potentially even bring children into the mix. And he's the one that's already provided the food. This is a beautiful picture of what the Goel can do, the kinsman redeemer. And the parallels with Christ are significant. As a matter of fact, let me ask this parallel. What city are we in?
Bethlehem.
Bethlehem. This is the place where we find the first Goel. Sorry. This is the first Goel. Thank you, Diane. I appreciate that. It makes you want to sing a Christmas song, doesn't it? This is the first Goel. Fast forward, and what you're going to see is the final Goel, who is born to us in the city of David, a Savior who is Christ the Lord. We see in the same town, through the relationship of Ruth all the way to Mary, which we looked at, the two maidservants last week, we're going to see the kinsman-redeemer in Boaz become the ultimate kinsman-redeemer in Christ out of this house of bread. The parallels are really, really significant. So we're now looking at verse 21. We've got this beautiful picture. We see the wheels beginning to turn in Naomi. We're thinking, hey, she's coming back. We're beginning to see a spiritual return to the land. Verse 21, and the author says, Ruth the Moabitess. So up to this point, he has said, my daughter, my daughter, my daughter, my daughter, my daughter. Now he calls her Ruth. Why do you think he calls her Ruth the Moabitess?
Reminder. Perhaps where she's come.
A reminder of what?
Where she was from.
Where she's from and where she is now and where she's potentially going.
Okay, so let's put it this way. Do we now see a contrast to who she has been and who she is now?
Mm-hmm.
The reminder here is, let's not forget, this was the outcast that by grace and grace alone has been brought into the family, has been provided for. All the different ways that grace has abundantly blessed her. Let us never forget, this is who she was, but it's not who she is now. So Ruth the Moabitess said, he also said to me, you shall stay close by my young men until they have finished how much?
Oh, my harvest.
Yeah.
This is not just stay close to the men because you can only glean today. Stay close to my young men so that you can finish the entire 6-week harvest. Friends, if she brought in 30 pounds today, which lasts a week, and she's going to be out there 6 weeks gleaning, she's going to bring in food. Now, sorry, it's not lobster thermidor, but this is sustenance. This is provision. This is food. This is sustenance. This is manna in the wilderness. Notice nobody's complaining about 6 weeks of barley, which is a wonderful thing, just like the nation of Israel that complained after a period of time, hey, Lord, could you give us a little meat? We're tired of bread. So we get this picture of the full harvest. Naomi said to Ruth, now look at verse 22. Naomi said to Ruth, her what?
My daughter-in-law.
Okay. You see the contrast he's given us here? She's not the Moabitess. She's the daughter-in-law. Says, it's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women and that people do not meet you in any other field. Stay with him, stay close beside him, stay close with his people, stay with him. Don't go to any other field. This is a close relative. This is the Goel. This is the one who's going to do it. Stay with her. He's going to bring you protection. He's going to bring the blessing. And by the way, that's a blessing that's also going to be for me. Remain close to this Redeemer. Notice, though, Naomi still has not said, and oh, by the way, I'll join you in the fields tomorrow. Oh, by the way, let me go say hi to my relative Boaz. Let me go sit down with him and have a Starbucks with him, and let's get caught up on old times. Hadn't happened yet. So she's had a little bit of a turn. She's still sitting out here, not quite all fully engaged. And verse 23 to conclude, so she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest, and don't forget this, and the wheat harvest. So now she gets to stay 12 weeks. She gleans for 6 weeks of the barley harvest and 6 weeks of the wheat harvest. And she dwelt with her mother-in-law. She has a roof over her head. She has a purpose. She has food. She's under the protection of the Goel. Things are pretty good for Ruth. And by extension, things are pretty good for Naomi. So if you're Ruth, how are you feeling right now?
Charlie said
Tired. Headache.
Are you feeling blessed? Yeah.
Tired and a headache.
Yeah. Are you feeling blessed?
Yeah.
If you're Naomi, how are you feeling right now?
Really good. Really blessed.
If you're Boaz, how are you feeling right now?
I'm sure pretty good.
This is what grace does. So the Goel of grace, by the way, is individual. It is all about our Redeemer, Jesus Christ, and how he is a Redeemer for each one of us. He is our Goel. He is for Ruth. He is for Naomi in a different way. He is for Boaz in a different way. He is for each one of us. He is individual. Had an old friend of mine who said that one of the character traits of God is that he's omnipersonal. He can be intimate with each one of us at the same time, just how we need him. So we get this beautiful statement, and we're this Jewish audience listening to this story, knowing that something big is getting ready to happen. All of these little pieces are being put together, and something big is about ready to happen. And it reminds me when my two boys, who are now, good gracious, 37 and 33, when my two boys were growing up, here's what we used to say to them when they would ask us questions or want to do things that were beyond their capability. We would tell them when they were 3, 4, 5, we'd tell them, you want to do that? You can do that when you're 7. 7 was a big age for us. You want us to answer that question? We'll answer that question when you're 7. And our oldest son came to us one day. He was about 5, and he said, I can't wait till I'm 7. I can't wait. I'm going to learn all this stuff. I'm going to be able to do all this stuff when I'm 7. The interesting thing is when they got to be 7, all of a sudden they had some friends who were in junior high, and they couldn't wait to be in junior high. Well, they got to junior high, and they saw some friends in high school. They couldn't wait to get into high school. They get into high school, they see friends who are seniors, and man, seniors are the greatest. I can't wait to be a senior. I'll have the world at my footsteps. Well, once they got to be seniors, then it was college. Things are really going to shine for me when I'm in college. Once they got through college, it was my first job. I can't wait to get that first job. And then all of a sudden it was marriage, and on and on and on, waiting for the big thing that's going to happen. When in reality, friends, the big thing is happening around us every single day, because God's grace is abundantly around us every single day. And the question is, do we recognize it? Are we like Naomi sitting in the house? We like Ruth out in the field. We like Boaz out in the field, actually walking in the grace that surrounds us. Because when we are, and when we walk in that grace that surrounds us, we recognize it, we walk in it, we actually engage in it, we see God everywhere. Big things happen. And I don't necessarily mean big that has to be, parting the Red Sea. But big things happen in terms of our intimacy with Christ, in terms of the individuality of grace, in terms of how we reflect Christ to the world, how that can radically change us, and it can radically change the people around us. What we find here is, we find wondering if we recognize the Goel in our midst. And as the Goel in our midst, do we recognize how abundantly graced we are, and do we live like it? There's grace. The goal of grace is that intimacy. The goodness of grace is that investment, that infectiousness of grace around us. And the Goel of grace is that it's individual to each one of us. The beautiful picture of grace in verses 14 through the end of the chapter, grace just abounds and overflows. And we ask ourselves the question, if the Goel is in my midst, do I recognize him and the grace that he's abundantly blessed me with? Questions? Thoughts?
Amazing.
What did you tell him?
I said, it's just so amazing.
It is.
It's so amazing to realize that it isn't just Ruth and Naomi. It's me. It's all of us, each of us.
Yeah. That's a great point. It is one of my favorite things about the Book of Ruth because it is not only timeless. Book of Ruth affects every one of us. Now, I mean, all of Scripture does that. But the thing that I love about the Book of Ruth, it practically affects us in ways that every time you study it, you go, oh, okay, that's me. Oh, I wish I was Ruth. Oh, I'd like to be more like Boaz. Oh, gee, do I hate being Naomi right now? Yeah. Yeah, it affects us all the time.
You know, Mark, I'm just thinking about Naomi in a way I never did before, and that is just from this lesson. We talked about last week how she stayed home, and I kind of joked about that's why she was depressed, but now I'm seeing she really is like the nation of Israel. She's missing the blessing of seeing God in action through Christ Jesus because she's staying home and she's living it kind of secondhand through Ruth. And it really makes me sad for her.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I mean, the nation of Israel is still doing that. I wonder how long it'll take until they say, come Lord Jesus. I mean, I'd hate for it to be any worse than it is right now.
Well, the beauty of it, and that's a great point, Diane, the beauty of it for our brothers and sisters is that there are those that are recognizing it. There are those that are walking in it. There is a nation that God will, he has promised us out of Daniel, they will one day recognize it. They are still his chosen people. And so it should drive us to a couple things. First of all, it should drive us to continue to pray for them. And pray that God's going to open their eyes to the reality of who the Mashiach is, that it is Christ, and that abundant blessing of being in the midst of so much grace. In the meantime, the beautiful thing for us is we begin to recognize fully how graced we are, and that should never, ever, ever deter us from extending that grace beyond us. I mean, when we see what Boaz has done, when we see what Ruth has done, and by the way, just a quick aside, did Naomi deserve this? The way she's been acting, did she deserve any of this?
No.
So that has nothing to do with it. And the beautiful thing is we're going to grace form Naomi too, which is a beautiful statement about what grace can do. You want to see people's lives change around you? Kill them with grace. I mean, pour grace on them. You're going to see them transformed. Yeah.
True. That's true.
Other questions? Other thoughts?
You said something earlier about grace being poured out, and that's one side of it. And then to receive the grace. The choice is ours to receive the grace.
Yes.
Grace is being poured out. And how in the Christian faith, I think of Naomi too, is she played it safe. She stayed home. And here Ruth is going out into a neighborhood. She doesn't know anybody.
No.
And yet she's graced.
Yep.
And brings back the grace. And how, if
Yes.
you're saying we are to receive the grace and be a blessing to others, sometimes it's coming out of our comfort zone. To bless others.
That's a great point, and I'd probably put it into this category more times than not. it is coming out of our comfort zone, because comfort is one of those things that let me put it. The best way I can put it this way: comfort is one of those words that I would say God does not. He's never called us to be comfortable.
No.
He's called us to be obedient. And I will tell you, walking in obedience is rarely comfortable, but it's always exciting. It's always full of grace. It's always abounding. No matter where you are. I'll give you a quick story. And maybe I've shared this before. If I have, just wave your hand at me. My wife's mother trusted Christ at age 12, and then had a very difficult situation happen and basically turned her back on church, on any organized religion for 70 years. She came down with dementia, and it became pretty clear she was living by herself. We went and we actually brought her with us to Midland. I'm not sure that that's the best place to bring somebody with dementia to Midland, but we were there, so she was with us.
Heck, why not?
And as she continued to decline, our prayer was, and it was a very interesting prayer, but our prayer for her was this: that in her simplistic mind, which is what dementia does, you begin to have a simple mind. And in that simple mind, we wanted her to really fully understand the simple truth of the love of Christ. And she hadn't been to church for years. 70 years she hadn't been to church. Well, she started coming to church because I was preaching in the pulpit. And the beautiful thing in a year and a half is she heard the gospel multiple times. And I asked her one time, who is Jesus Christ? And she said, well, he's my Savior. We never had heard her say that in 70 years. We had never heard her say that. Well, we had to move her into this locked facility for dementia and Alzheimer's patients. And she really fought against it for about a week. And our prayer again was that in her simple mind, she would begin to see herself as a blessing to people in that place. Well, over the course of time, and she was there about a year and a half, over the course of time, she became known as the Blessing Lady.
Oh.
She would blow kisses. She would put her hands on either sides of faces. She would tell people, the Lord bless you. She did this to people. We even had a bench out in the foyer that was called the Blessing Bench, and she would sit there for hours and just bless people as they walked past. Even one woman who was, she had Down's syndrome, and my mother would come over to her every day, hold her face, tell her she loved her, and bless her. And she became known throughout this entire facility as the Blessing Lady. She was the Blessing Lady. All I can tell you is the simplicity of grace absolutely transforms us to the point that it just flows out of us. It just becomes part of who we are. And I will tell you, to this day, I think what God was doing was he was making up for 70 years of a loss of rewards. In that year and a half, she added to her reward. Her reward bag was overflowing because she was this blessing to person after person after person after person. It's just recognizing it in the midst of us and walking in it is transformative, not only to us, but to everybody around us. And Ruth is a beautiful example of Boaz is transformed, Ruth is transformed, and we're going to see Naomi's going to be transformed too. So hang on. Any other thoughts, questions?
Anybody else? Thank you. Thank you, Mark. This was wonderful as usual.
We'll be move forward chapter 3 next week, verses 1 through 9. Chapter 3, 1 through 9.
All right.
We'll see you next
we
week.
will be read up.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay.